Chapter 5. How Don Quixote returned home, and what happened to his library, and how he sallied forth a second time to seek adventures. Finding that he was unable to stir, the knight pleased himself whilst lying on the ground by remembering and repeating aloud passages from his favourite books. He was reciting the ballad of the Marquis of Mantua, in which a noble knight has an adventure similar to his own, when there chanced to pass by a labouring man, a neighbour of Don Quixote's, who was going to take a load of wheat to the mill. He, seeing a man stretched on the ground, came over to him and asked who he was, and what mishap had befallen him. Don Quixote at once believed that the labourer was no other than the Marquis of Mantua himself, and went on with his ballad, which gave an account of his disgrace. The labourer was astonished at all these follies, and taking off the knight's visor, which was all broken to pieces with the beating, he wiped his face, which was covered with dust, and when he had wiped it, he recognized him, and cried, "Señor Quixote," for so was he named before he became a knight-errant, "who has brought your worship to this plight?" But the knight only went on with his ballad, and made no answer. Seeing this, the good man took off, as well as he could, his breastplate and corslet, to see if he had any wound, but he found no blood nor sign of any. He tried to raise him from the ground, which he did at last with much ado. Then he remounted him upon his ass, which seemed a safer carriage than the knight's steed. Gathering up his arms, even to the fragments of the lance, he fastened them upon Rocinante, whose bridle he took hold of, as well as of the ass's halter, and so they journeyed towards the village, Don Quixote continuing to mutter his nonsensical stories. In this manner they arrived at last at their village about sunset, but the labourer waited until it grew somewhat dusk, so that folk should not see the knight so simply mounted. When he entered the village and went to Don Quixote's house, he found all in uproar there, for the curate and the barber, Don Quixote's great friends, were there, and his housekeeper was crying to them at the top of her voice, "What think ye has befallen my master? For 2 days both he and his horse, together with the target, lance, and armour, have been missing. Woe is me! I'm certain those horrid books of knighthood have turned his brain, for I've often heard him say that he would become a knight-errant and go and seek adventures throughout the world." And Don Quixote's niece, who was there also, said to Master Nicholas the barber, "And indeed I have known my dear uncle continue reading these unhappy books of disadventures 2 days and 2 nights together, at the end of which, throwing down the book, he would lay hand on his sword and would fall a slashing of the walls. And when he was wearied, he would say that he had slain 4 giants as great as 4 towers. And I take great blame to myself that I did not tell you all this before, that you might have burned those wretched books which have caused all the mischief." "So I say too," said the curate, "and tomorrow they shall feed the flames, so that they may do no further harm." By this time the labourer and Don Quixote had come to the house, and all the household, hearing them arrive, ran to embrace him, and Don Quixote, who had not yet dismounted from the ass, for he was not able, said, "Stand still, and touch me not, for I return very sore, wounded, and hurt through the fault of my steed. Carry me to bed, and summon, if it be possible, the wise Urganda, that she may examine and cure my wounds." "Come, my dear master," said his housekeeper, "and welcome, for without sending for that Urganda, we shall know how to cure thee well enough. Accursed, say I once again, and 100 times accursed may those books of knighthood be which have brought you to such a pass." With that they bore him up to his bed, and searching for his wounds could not find any. Then he said he was all one bruise, through having a grievous fall with his horse Rocinante in a fight with 10 giants, the most enormous and the boldest that could be found on earth. "So ho," said the curate, "there are giants about, are there? By mine honesty, I will burn them all before tomorrow night." The next day, while the knight was asleep, the curate asked the niece for the keys of the library, which she gave him with a very good will. Then they all went in, the housekeeper with them, and found more than 100 very large volumes, well bound, besides other smaller ones. The curate asked the barber to hand him down the books from their shelves one by one, that he might see whether any deserved to escape the fire. "No, no," cried the niece, "you ought not to pardon any of them, seeing they have all been offenders. Better fling them all out of the window into the yard, and make a heap of them, and then make a bonfire of them, where the smoke will offend nobody." With that, the housekeeper caught hold of some of the largest and flung them out of the window. But the curate took down several from the shelves and began to examine them carefully, whilst the women cried out for their destruction. Whilst they were thus busied, Don Quixote began to cry aloud, saying, this way, valorous knights! Show the force of your valiant arms, lest we lose the tournament!" Called away by this noise and clamour, they left the books and ran to Don Quixote, who had risen from his bed and was repeating his outcries and ravings, cutting about with his sword all over the room with slashes and backstrokes, as wide awake as if he had never been asleep. Wherefore, taking him up in their arms, they returned him by main force into his bed. With some difficulty they persuaded him to rest where he was, and after he had eaten his breakfast, he fell asleep once again. That same night the housekeeper set fire to and burned all the books in the yard, and some went into the flames that had no harm in them. And thus was fulfilled the old proverb, "The saint sometimes pays for the sinner." Now one of the remedies which the curate and the barber suggested for their friend's malady was to wall up and close his library, so that when he rose he should not find the books, and they might tell him the enchanters had carried them off, room and all. This was done, and when 2 days afterwards Don Quixote rose from his bed, the first thing he did was to go and visit his books. Not finding the library where he had left it, he went from one corner of the house to the other, looking for it. Sometimes he came to the place where the door had been, and felt it with his hands. Then he would turn his eyes up and down, here and there, to seek it, without speaking a word. But at last he asked the housekeeper where his library was. She, being well schooled what she should answer, replied, "What library? There is neither library nor books in this house now, for an enchanter has carried them all away." "Yes, dear uncle," said his niece, "while you were away, an enchanter came upon a cloud, and alighting from a serpent on which he was riding, entered the library, and what he did therein I know not. But within a while after, he fled out at the roof of the house, and left all the place full of smoke. And when we went to see what he had done, we found neither room nor books." "This must be the work of the learned enchanter Freston," replied Don Quixote seriously, "a great enemy of mine, who has a grudge against me. For he knows through his arts and his learning that I am in course of time to fight and vanquish in single combat a knight whom he favours. But I tell him it is useless to oppose what is decreed." "Who doubts that, dear uncle?" said his niece. "But why mix yourself up in these quarrels? Better stay at home peacefully, for remember the proverb says, 'Many who go for wool come back shorn.'" "O niece of mine," said Don Quixote, "how little dost thou understand the matter. Before I am shorn, I will pluck the beards of all who think to touch but a hair of me." To these words the women made no reply, because they saw his anger increase. For 15 days after this he remained quietly at home, without showing any sign of repeating his follies, and during this time he had many arguments with his friends the curate and the barber about his favourite knights errant. At the same time he was persuading a certain labourer, his neighbour, an honest man, but one of very shallow wit, to go away with him and serve him as squire. In the end he gave him so many fair words and promises that the poor fellow determined to go with him. Don Quixote, among other things, told him that he ought to be very pleased to depart with him, for at some time or other an adventure might befall, which should in the twinkling of an eye win him an island, and leave him governor thereof. On the faith of these and other like promises, Sancho Panza, for so he was called, forsook his wife and children, and took services as squire to his neighbour. Don Quixote then set about to provide himself with money. This he did by selling one thing, pawning another, and making bad bargains all around. At last he got a pretty sum, and having patched up his broken helmet as best he could, he told Sancho Panza the day and hour on which he meant to start. He also charged him to provide himself with a wallet, which Sancho promised to do, and said that he also meant to take a very good ass named Dapple along with him, which he had of his own, because he was not used to travel much afoot. In the matter of the ass, Don Quixote hesitated a little, calling to mind whether ever he had read that any knight-errant was ever attended by a squire mounted on ass-back. but no such case occurred to his memory. Nevertheless, he decided that the ass should be taken with the intention of providing his squire with a more dignified mount when he had a chance, by unhorsing the first discourteous knight he met with. All this being arranged, Sancho Panza, without bidding his wife and children farewell, and Don Quixote, without saying goodbye to his housekeeper and niece, sallied forth from the village one night, unknown to any person living. They travelled so far that night that at daybreak they were safe against discovery, even if they were pursued. And Sancho Panza rode along with his beast like a patriarch, with his wallet and bottle, full of a huge desire to see himself governor of the island which his master had promised him. Chapter 6. Of the dreadful and never-to-be-imagined adventure of the windmills, and of the fearful battle which the gallant Biscayan fought with Don Quixote. Whilst they were journeying along, Sancho Panza said to his master, "I pray you have good care, Sir Knight, that you forget not the government of the island, which you have promised me, for I shall be able to govern it, be it never so great." And Don Quixote replied, "Thou must understand, friend Sancho, that it was a custom very much used by ancient knights errant to make their squires governors of the islands and kingdoms they conquered, and I am resolved that so good a custom shall be kept up by me. And if thou livest, and I live, it may well be that I might conquer a kingdom within 6 days, and crown thee king of it." "By the same token," said Sancho Panza, "if I were a king, then should Joan my wife become a queen, and my children princes?" "Who doubts of that?" said Don Quixote. "That do I," replied Sancho Panza, "for I am fully persuaded that though it rained kingdoms down upon the earth, none of them would sit well on my wife Joan. She is not worth a farthing for a queen. She might scrape through as a countess, but I have my doubts about that." As they were talking, they caught sight of some 30 or 40 windmills on a plain. As soon as Don Quixote saw them, he said to his squire, "Fortune is guiding our affairs better than we could desire, for behold, friend Sancho, how there appear 30 or 40 monstrous giants, with whom I mean to do battle, and take all their lives. With their spoils we will begin to be rich, for this is fair war, and it is doing great service to clear away these evil fellows from off the face of the earth." "What giants?" said Sancho, amazed. "Those thou seest there," replied his master, "with the long arms." "Take care, sir," cried Sancho, "for those we see yonder are not giants, but windmills, and those things which seem to be arms are their sails, which, being whirled round by the wind, make the mill go." "It is clear," answered Don Quixote, "that thou art not yet experienced in the matter of adventures. They are giants, and if thou art afraid, get thee away home, whilst I enter into cruel and unequal battle with them." So saying, he clapped spurs to Rocinante, without heeding the cries by which Sancho Panza warned him that he was going to encounter not giants, but windmills. For he would neither listen to Sancho's outcries, nor mark what he said, but shouted to the windmills in a loud voice, "Fly not, cowards and vile creatures, for it is only one knight that assaults you." A slight breeze having sprung up at this moment, the great sail arms began to move, on seeing which Don Quixote shouted out again, "Although you wield more arms than had the giant Briareus, I shall make you pay for your insolence." Saying this, and commending himself most devoutly to his lady Dulcinea, whom he desired to aid him in this peril, covering himself with his buckler, and setting his lance in rest, he charged at Rocinante's best gallop, and attacked the first mill before him. Thrusting his lance through the sail, the wind turned it with such violence that it broke his weapon into shivers, carrying him and his horse after it, and having whirled them round, finally tumbled the knight a good way off, and rolled him over the plain sorely damaged. Sancho Panza hastened to help him as fast as his ass could go, and when he came up he found the knight unable to stir. Such a shock had Rocinante given him in the fall. "Bless me," said Sancho, Did I not tell you that you should look well what you did? For they were none other than windmills, nor could any think otherwise unless he had windmills in his brains." "Peace, friend Sancho," said Don Quixote, "for the things of war are constantly changing, and I think this must be the work of the same sage Freston, who robbed me of my library and books, and he hath changed these giants into windmills to take from me the glory of the victory. But in the end his evil arts shall avail but little against the goodness of my sword." "May it prove so," said Sancho, as he helped his master to rise and remount Rocinante, who, poor steed, was himself much bruised by the fall. The next day they journeyed along towards the pass of La Pice, a romantic spot, at which they arrived about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. "Here," said Don Quixote to his squire, "we may hope to dip our hands up to the elbows in what are called adventures. But take note of this, that although thou seest me in the greatest dangers of the world, thou art not to set hand to thy sword in my defence, unless those who assault me be base or vulgar people. If they be knights, thou mayest not help me." "I do assure you, sir," said Sancho, "that herein you shall be most punctually obeyed, because I am by nature a quiet and peaceful man, and have a strong dislike to thrusting myself into quarrels." Whilst they spoke thus, 2 friars of the order of St. Benedict, mounted on large mules, big enough to be dromedaries, appeared coming along the road. They wore travelling masks to keep the dust out of their eyes, and carried large sun umbrellas. After them came a coach with 4 or 5 a horseback travelling with it, and 2 lackeys ran hard by it. In the coach was a Biscayan lady who was going to Seville. The friars were not of her company, though all were going the same way. Scarcely had Don Quixote espied them than he exclaimed to his squire, "Either I much mistake, or this should be the most famous adventure that hath ever been seen, for those dark forms that loom yonder are doubtless enchanters who are carrying off in that coach some princess they have stolen. Therefore I must, with all my power, undo this wrong." "This will be worse than the adventure of the windmills," said Sancho. "Do you not see that they are Benedictine friars, and the coach will belong to some people travelling?" "I have told thee already, Sancho," answered Don Quixote, "that thou art very ignorant in the matter of adventures. What I say is true, as thou shalt see." So saying, he spurred on his horse, and posted himself in the middle of the road, along which the friars were coming, and when they were near enough to hear him, he exclaimed in a loud voice, "Monstrous and horrible crew, surrender this instant those exalted princesses whom you are carrying away in that coach, or prepare to receive instant death as a just punishment of your wicked deeds." The friars drew rein and stood amazed at the figure and words of Don Quixote, to whom they replied, "Sir Knight, we are neither monstrous nor wicked, but 2 religious men, Benedictines, travelling about our business, and we know nothing about this coach or any princesses." "No soft words for me," cried Don Quixote, "for I know you well, treacherous knaves." And without waiting for their reply, he set spurs to Rocinante, and laying his lance on his thigh, charged at the first friar with such fury and rage that if he had not leaped from his mule, he would have been slain, or at least badly wounded. The second friar, seeing the way his companion was treated, made no words, but fled across the country swifter than the wind itself. Sancho Panza, on seeing the friar overthrown, dismounted very speedily off his ass and ran over to him, and would have stripped him of his clothes. But 2 of the friar's servants came up and asked him why he was thus despoiling their master. Sancho replied that it was his due by the law of arms, as lawful spoils gained in battle by his lord and master, Don Quixote. The lackeys, who knew nothing of battles or spoils, seeing that Don Quixote was now out of the way, speaking with those that were in the coach, set both at once upon Sancho, and threw him down, plucked every hair out of his beard, and kicked and mauled him without mercy, leaving him at last stretched on the ground, senseless and breathless. As for the friar, he mounted again, trembling and terror-stricken, all the color having fled from his face, and spurring his mule, he joined his companion, who was waiting for him hard by. While this was happening, Don Quixote was talking to the lady in the coach, to whom he said, "Dear lady, you may now dispose of yourself as you best please, for the pride of your robbers is laid in the dust by this my invincible arm, and that you may not pine to learn the name of your deliverer, know that I am called Don Quixote of the Mancha, knight-errant, adventurer, and captive of the peerless and beauteous Lady Dulcinea of Toboso, and in reward of the benefits you have received at my hands, I demand nothing else but that you return to Toboso, there to present yourself in my name before my lady, and tell her what I have done to obtain your liberty." All this was listened to by a Biscayan squire who accompanied the coach. He, hearing that the coach was not to pass on, but was to return to Toboso, went up to Don Quixote, and laying hold of his lance, said to him, "Get away with thee, Sir Knight, for if thou leave not the coach, I will kill thee, as sure as I am a Biscayan." "If," replied Don Quixote haughtily, "thou were a gentleman, as thou art not, I would ere this have punished thy folly and insolence, caitiff creature." "I, no gentleman!" cried the enraged Biscayan. "Throw down thy lance and draw thy sword, and thou shalt soon see that thou liest." "That shall be seen presently," replied Don Quixote, and flinging his lance to the ground, he drew his sword, grasped his buckler tight, and rushed at the Biscayan. The Biscayan, seeing him come on in this manner, had nothing else to do but to draw his sword. Luckily for him, he was near the coach, whence he snatched a cushion to serve him as a shield, and then they fell on one another as if they had been mortal enemies. Those that were present tried to stop them, but the Biscayan shouted out that if he were hindered from ending the battle, he would put his lady and all who touched him to the sword. The lady, amazed and terrified, made the coachman draw aside a little, and sat watching the deadly combat from afar. The Biscayan, to begin with, dealt Don Quixote a mighty blow over the target, which, if it had not been for his armor, would have cleft him to the waist. Don Quixote, feeling the weight of this tremendous blow, which had destroyed his visor and carried away part of his ear, cried out loud, "O Dulcinea, lady of my soul, flower of all beauty, help thy knight who finds himself in this great danger." To say this, to raise his sword, to cover himself with his buckler, and to rush upon the Biscayan was the work of a moment. With his head full of rage, he now raised himself in his stirrups, and gripping his sword more firmly in his two hands, struck at the Biscayan with such violence that he caught him a terrible blow on the cushion, knocking this shield against his head with tremendous violence. It was as though a mountain had fallen on the Biscayan and crushed him, and the blood spouted from his nose and mouth and ears. He would have fallen straightway from his mule if he had not clasped her round the neck, but he lost his stirrups, then let go his arms, and the mule, frightened at the blow, began to gallop across the fields, so that after 2 or 3 plunges it threw him to the ground. Don Quixote leaped off his horse, ran towards him, and setting the point of his sword between his eyes, bade him yield, or he would cut off his head. The lady of the coach now came forward in great grief, and begged the favour of her squire's life. Don Quixote replied with great stateliness, "Truly, fair lady, I will grant thy request, but it must be on one condition, that this squire shall go to Toboso and present himself in my name to the peerless Lady Dulcinea, that she may deal with him as she thinks well." The lady, who was in great distress, without considering what Don Quixote required, or asking who Dulcinea might be, promised that he should certainly perform this command.
Then, said Don Quixote, on the faith of that pledge, I will do him no more harm.
Seeing the contest was now over and his master about to remount Rocinante, Sancho ran to hold his stirrups, and before he mounted, taking him by his hand, he kissed it and said, I desire that it will please you, good my lord Don Quixote, to bestow on me the government of that island, which in this terrible battle you have won. To which Don Quixote replied, Brother Sancho, these are not the adventures of islands, but of crossroads, wherein nothing is gained but a broken pate or the loss of an ear. Have patience a while, for the adventures will come whereby I can make thee not only a governor, but something higher. Sancho thanked him heartily, and kissed his hand again, and the hem of his mailed shirt. Then he helped him to get on Rocinante, and leaped upon his ass to follow him. And Don Quixote, without another word to the people of the coach, rode away at a swift pace, and turned into a wood that was hard by, leaving Sancho to follow him as fast as his beast could trot. Chapter 7. Of what passed between Don Quixote and the goatherds, and of the unfortunate adventures with the Yanguesian carriers. As they rode along, Don Quixote turned to his squire and said to him, Tell me now, in very good earnest, didst thou ever see a more valorous knight than I am throughout the face of the earth? Didst thou ever read in histories of any other that hath or ever had more courage in fighting, more dexterity in wounding, or more skill in overthrowing? The truth is, replied Sancho, that I have never read any history whatever, for I can neither read nor write. But what I dare wager is that I never in my life served a bolder master than you are, and I only trust that all this boldness does not land us within the four walls of the jail.
Peace, friend Sancho, said Don Quixote. When didst thou read of a knight-errant that was brought before the judge, though he killed ever so many people?
I have read nothing, as you know, good master, but a truce to all this. Let me attend to your wound, for you are losing a good deal of blood in that ear, and I have got some lint and a little white ointment in my wallet.
That, said Don Quixote, would have been unnecessary if I had remembered to make a bottleful of the balsam of Fierebra, for with only one drop of it both time and medicines are saved.
What balsam is that, then? Asked Sancho Panza.
It is a balsam, the receipt of which I have in my memory, and whoever possesses it need not fear death, nor think to perish by any wound. Therefore, after I have made it and given it unto thee, thou hast nothing else to do, but when thou shalt see that in any battle I be cloven in twain, then deftly to take up the portion of the body which is fallen to the ground, and put it up again on the half which remains in the saddle, taking great care to fix it exactly in the right place. Then thou shalt give me 2 draughts of the balsam I have mentioned, and I shall become as sound as an apple.
If that be true, said Sancho, I renounce from now the government of the promised island, and will demand nothing else in payment of my services, but only the receipt of this precious liquor. But tell me, is it costly in making?
With less than 3 reals, said Don Quixote, a man may make 3 gallons of it. But I mean to teach thee greater secrets than this, and do thee greater favours also. And now let me dress my wound, for this ear pains me more than I would wish.
Sancho took out of his wallet his lint and ointment to cure his master, but before he could use them, Don Quixote saw that the visor of his helmet was broken, and he had like to have lost his senses. Setting his hand to his sword, he cried, I swear on oath to lead the life which was led by the great Marquis of Mantua when he swore to revenge the death of his nephew Baldwin, which was not to eat off a tablecloth, nor to comb his hair, nor to change his clothes, nor to quit his armour, and other things which, though I cannot now remember, I take as said, until I have had complete revenge on him that hath done this outrage. Look, your worship, Sir Don Quixote, said Sancho, when he heard these strange words. You must note that if the Biscayan has done what you told him, and presented himself before my lady Dulcinea of Toboso, then he has fully satisfied his debt, and deserves no other penalty unless he commits a new fault.
Thou hast spoken well, and hit the mark truly, answered Don Quixote, and therefore, in respect of that, I set the oath aside. But I make it, and confirm it again, that I will lead the life I have said, until I take by force another helmet as good as this from some other knight.
Such oaths are but mischief, said Sancho discontentedly. For tell me now, if by chance we do not come across a man armed with a helmet, what are we to do? Do but consider that armed men travel not these roads, but only carriers and wagoners, who not only wear no helmets, but never heard them named all the days of their life.
Thou art mistaken in this, said Don Quixote, for we shall not have been here 2 hours before we shall see more knights than went up against Albraca to win Angelica the Fair.
So be it, said Sancho, and may all turn out well for us, that the time may come for the winning of that island which is costing me so dear.
Have no fear for thine island, Sancho Panza, said Don Quixote. And now, look, if thou hast aught to eat in thy wallet, for soon we should go in search of some castle where we may lodge the night, and make the balsam of which I have spoken, for in truth this ear of mine pains me greatly.
I have got here an onion and a bit of cheese, and a few crusts of bread, but such coarse food is not fit for so valiant a knight as your worship.
How little dost thou understand the matter, replied Don Quixote, for it is an honour to knights-errant not to eat more than once a month, and if by chance they should eat, to eat only of that which is next at hand. And all this thou mightest have known hadst thou read as many books as I have done. For though I studied many, yet did I never find that knights-errant did ever eat, but by mere chance, or at some costly banquets that were made for them, and the remainder of their days they lived on herbs and roots. Therefore, friend Sancho, let not that trouble thee, which is my pleasure, for to a knight-errant that which comes is good.
Pardon me, sir, said Sancho, for since I can neither read nor write, as I have already told you, I have not fallen in rightly with the laws of knighthood, but henceforth my wallet shall be furnished with all sorts of dried fruits for your worship, because you are a knight, and for myself, seeing I am none, I will provide fowls and other things which are better eating. So saying, he pulled out what he had, and the two fell to dinner in good peace and company. But being desirous to look out for a lodging for that night, they cut short their meagre and sorry meal, mounted at once a horseback, and made haste to find out some dwellings before night did fall. But the sun and their hopes did fail them at the same time, they being then near the cabins of some goatherds. Therefore they determined to pass the night there. And though Sancho's grief was great to lie out of a village, yet Don Quixote was more joyful than ever, for he thought that as often as he slept under the open heaven, so often did he perform an act worthy of a true knight-errant. They were welcomed by the goatherds very cordially, and Sancho, having put up Rocinante and his ass the best way he could, made his way towards the smell given out by certain pieces of goat's flesh which were boiling in a pot on the fire. And though he longed that very instant to see if they were ready, he did not do so, for he saw the goatherds were themselves taking them off the fire and spreading some sheepskins on the ground, and were laying their rustic table as quickly as might be. Then, with many expressions of good-will, they invited the two to share in what they had. Those who belonged to the field, being 6 in number, sat round on the skins, having first with rough compliments asked Don Quixote to seat himself upon a trough, which they placed for him turned upside down. Don Quixote sat down, but Sancho remained on foot to serve him with the cup which was made of horn. Seeing him standing, his master said, "That thou mayest see, Sancho, the good which is in knight-errantry, and how fair a chance they have who exercise it to arrive at honour and position in the world, I desire that here by my side, and in company of these good people, thou dost seat thyself, and be one and the same with me, that am thy master and natural lord, that thou dost eat in my dish, and drink in the same cup wherein I drink. For the same may be said of knight-errantry, as is said of love, that it makes all things equal." "Thanks for your favour," replied Sancho, "but I may tell your worship that, provided I have plenty to eat,
I can eat it as well and better, standing, and by myself, than if I were seated on a level with an emperor. And indeed, if I speak the truth, what I eat in my corner without ceremony, though it be but bread and onion, smacks much better than turkey cocks at other tables, where I must chew my meat leisurely, drink but little, wipe my hands often, nor do other things that solitude and liberty allow." "For all that," said Don Quixote, "here shalt thou sit, for the humble shall be exalted." And taking him by the arm, he forced a squire to sit down near himself. The goatherds did not understand the gibberish of squires and knights errant, and did nothing but eat, hold their peace, and stare at their guests, who with great relish were gorging themselves with pieces as big as their fists. The course of flesh being over, the goatherds spread on the skins a great number of parched acorns and half a cheese, harder than if it had been made of mortar. The horn in the meantime was not idle, but came full from the wineskins and returned empty, as though it had been a bucket sent to the well. After Don Quixote had satisfied his appetite, he took up a fistful of acorns, and beholding them earnestly, began in this manner: "Happy time and fortunate ages were those which our ancestors called golden, not because gold, so much prized in this our iron age, was gotten in that happy time without any labours, but because those who lived in that time knew not these two words, thine and mine. In that holy age all things were in common. No man needed to do aught but lift up his hand and take his food from the strong oak, which did liberally invite them to gather his sweet and savoury fruit. The clear fountains and running rivers did offer them transparent water in magnificent abundance, and in the hollow trees did careful bees erect their commonwealth, offering to every hand, without interest, the fertile crop of their sweet labours." Thus did the eloquent knight describe the golden age, when all was peace, friendship, and concord, and then he showed the astonished goatherds how an evil world had taken its place, and made it necessary for knights errant like himself to come forward for the protection of widows and orphans and the defence of distressed damsels. All this he did because the acorns that were given him called to his mind the golden age. The goatherds sat and listened with grave attention, and Sancho made frequent visits to the second wineskin during his discourse. At length it was ended, and they sat round the fire, drinking their wine and listening to one of the goatherds singing, and towards night, Don Quixote's ear becoming very painful, one of his hosts made a dressing of rosemary leaves and salt, and bound up his wound. By this means, eased of his pain, he was able to lie down in one of the huts and sleep soundly after his day's adventures. Don Quixote spent several days among the goatherds, and at length, when his wound was better, he thanked them for their hospitality, and rode away in search of new adventures, followed by the faithful Sancho. They came to a halt in a pleasant meadow rich with beautiful grass by the side of a delightful and refreshing stream, which seemed to invite them to stop and spend there the sultry hours of noon, which were already becoming oppressive. Don Quixote and Sancho dismounted, and leaving Rocinante and Dapple loose to feed on the grass that was there in plenty, they ransacked the wallet, and without any ceremony fell to eating what they found in it. Sancho had neglected to tie up Rocinante, and, as luck would have it, a troop of Galician ponies belonging to some Yanguesian carriers, whose custom it is to rest at noon with their teams in spots and places where grass and water abound, were feeding in the same valley. It must be believed that Rocinante supposed that the grass the ponies were feeding on was better than his own, but be that as it may, he started off at a little swift trot to feed among them. They resented his appearance, and as he sought to enter their ranks and feed among them, they received him with their heels and teeth, with such vigor that in a trice he had burst his girth, and his saddle was stripped from his back. But the worst of all was that the carriers, taking part with their own ponies, ran up with stakes, and so belaboured him that they brought him to the ground in a sore plight. Upon this, Don Quixote and Sancho, who witnessed the basting of Rocinante, came running up all out of breath, and Don Quixote said to Sancho, From what I see, friend Sancho, these be no knights, but base rascally fellows of low breeding. I say this, that thou mayest freely aid me in taking vengeance for the wrong which they have done to Rocinante before our eyes."
"What vengeance can we take," replied Sancho, "when there are more than 20, and we are but 2? Nay, perhaps but 1.5.
"I count for 100,
said Don Quixote, and without further parley, he drew his sword and flew upon the Yanguesians, boldly followed by Sancho Panza. With his first blow, Don Quixote pierced a buff coat that one of them wore, wounding him grievously in the shoulder. Then the Yanguesians, finding themselves so rudely handled by 2 men only, they being so many, betook themselves to their stakes, and hemming in their adversaries in the midst of them, they laid on with great fury. In fact, the second thwack brought Sancho to the ground, and the same fate soon befell Don Quixote, whose dexterity and courage availed him nothing, for he fell at the feet of his unfortunate steed, who had not yet been able to arise. Then, seeing the mischief they had done, the Yanguesians loaded their team with as much haste as possible, and went their way, leaving the adventurers in a doleful plight and a worse humour.